Live from the virtual lounge in cyberspace, it's Beats and Eats. A happy hour for the mind, featuring the best in conversation and pop culture. Food, music, movies, comedy, you name it. And you'll never know who'll be dropping by to pay us a visit. We've got a show. We need hosts. And here they are, TyRae and Nick Gelso.
The virtual lounge is open. Once again, it's TyRae, Nick Gelso, Scott Mitchell pouring the... Do you pour Bartles and James or do you serve them? As you can tell, it's an 80s edition of Beats and Eats. I'll take a Jolt Cola, please.
I'll take the new Cola.
Yeah, there you go. Wait a minute. It lasted like 24 hours, didn't it, back then?
It did. It was terrible. And I'll take a Shasta instead.
There you go.
A Tab.
Oh, Rite Aid. Was it
Rite Aid?
What was it? Diet Rite. Rite Aid's a store.
Rite Aid's a store, yeah.
As you can tell, we've got 80s on the mind today, and we have a very special guest. Somebody who has podcasted longer than Nick or myself. This man, what do you call him? He's a podcast historian. He's a trailblazer. I don't know.
Podfather.
The Podfather, yes. It's Steve Spears, who does a blog for the Tampa Bay Times. It's all 80s, Nick. He is literally stuck in the 80s, and how appropriate for what we're doing right now with all these 80s-themed episodes.
And what I like the most is, and listeners will hear as we go to the interview, is less of an interview, totally a conversation.
And we had to stop it. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Stop the interview, or this would have been a mini-series. The equivalent of 80s television miniseries. Remember in the 80s, we had nothing but miniseries. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Rich Man, Poor Man, The Winds of War.
Yep.
Do you remember watching those as a kid? Like with your parents? These like 5-part series. You know, it's like, can this get over with? I want to watch Laverne and Shirley.
Yeah, I know. Come on.
We now preempt this program to present, you remember those days, but
of course.
Yeah, back in the days when we had 4 channels, too poor for HBO.
Yep. Too poor for HBO. I remember when we got it was like all the kids in the neighborhood came over to watch it. And then it was you could only watch it at certain points because late at night it would go a little softcore.
Down. Right.
Come on.
And then
we used to sneak downstairs.
Watch this.
We had the box.
Right. So it was scrambled. The naked pictures were scrambled.
Yes, they were. You literally had to get up to the TV. Well, we did have a remote, but it had a cord attached to it. But you'd have to get up to the TV to turn on HBO. You'd have to flip the box.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? It was like not FM AM, but basically the same concept.
And the thing was back then, Nick, they weren't like the Skinamax movies yet, right? They were like these really bad, nudie British comedies.
Yes, and like too much OCB. You know what OCB is?
Yes,
like all the women had
yes, I do remember all too well.
Throw in the French one with hairy armpits on women.
Wait, is that a boob? I think so.
Yeah, what? Yeah, slow mo. Pause it. We did a beta V scar out.
Exactly. That's a topic I don't think we'll bring up with Steve Spears, but we're going to bring up everything else with him, Nick. He's actually going on the 80s cruise. I can't wait to meet him.
The 80s cruise, baby. That and lynda.com, man. Keeping the lights on here in the virtual lounge. Don't forget, lynda.com is the home of expert tutorials given by the experts. And they're in video form.
Yeah, learn anything you want, right? Recently purchased by LinkedIn. That is a testimony in itself about the quality of lynda.com.
So go on over for your free trial from Ty, myself, Linda, LinkedIn, and all you have to do is log on to lynda.com/beatsandeats. It's free from there, baby. Free is for me.
And then our other sponsor, of course, Dick, we talked about it earlier, the 80s Cruise. Go to the 80scruise.com to hear about this amazing once-in-a-lifetime trip with some of the greatest musical artists from the 1980s, Nick. Huey Lewis, the headliner.
Huey Lewis. Modern English, our guest last week.
Modern English, Wang Chung, Richard Marx, Starship,
Tiffany.
Kool and the Gang. How could I forget Tiffany?
Who you're stalking.
Yeah, I'm trying to get Tiffany on the show. Something's not working. Maybe she's looking at my picture and says, you know what? I don't think so. I don't think that's for the show.
She's like, this guy's a creep.
This guy's a creep.
Why does he have a members only jacket? Creep. Let's go to Steve.
Let's do it.
This is Gavin McLeod, your captain speaking. You are listening to Beats and Eats.
Exciting and new. touching that dial's not an authorized move. Nick and Ty will be right back with more Beats and Eats.
Cruise back to the 80s on the first ever 80s cruise. That's right, 7 days in the most radical party to ever hit the high seas, with a totally awesome lineup of artists that define the sound of the decade. Join Huey Lewis and the News, Richard Marx, Starship, Kool and the Gang, A Flock of Seagulls, Modern English, Naked Eyes, Tiffany, Wang Chung, and Jessie's Girl, the ultimate 80s party band, and the original MTV VJs, Nina Blackwood, Mark Goodman, and Alan Hunter. As we cruise to exotic ports of call like Grand Turk, San Juan, St. Thomas, and the private island of Half Moon Cay, we're going all out by building an 80s video game arcade with Donkey Kong, Mario Brothers, and of course Pac-Man, showing movies like Ferris Bueller and Pretty in Pink, and there'll even be a VJ contest. Don't forget to pack your best 80s looks because we're having a prom night, a movie costume party, pajama party, and neon beach party. You can't miss this. Sailing from February 28th through March 6, 2016 for the most gnarly vacation ever. For more information, log on to the80scruise.com or call 844-384-8080.
I was a sobbing mess about 45 minutes ago.
How did you come up with the name, Cat Benatar? It's classic.
Cat Benatar.
Well, I had a cat before this cat named Nick Rhodes. And poor Nick left us before his time. He used to wear a kerchief and everything. He was very, very fancy. And I got this cat from an ex-girlfriend, and she had given it some crazy name that a man would never repeat to an animal. And so I thought, well, I'm going to call her Cat Benatar. And when this cat leaves me, I'm going to get a new one called Catrick Swayze.
Nice.
I like
it. I like it.
That.
So 80s of you. I just heard today, by the way, they're redoing Roadhouse.
Oh, no.
Speaking of the Ronda Rousey is going to be in the film.
Huh. Well, I'm not against that idea.
I mean, yeah, I guess that might work.
Should be interesting.
Is she the bouncer?
Yeah, that's a good question. She
Clearly,
pretty much kicked everybody's ass. Exactly.
Yeah. She must be the bouncer. She kicked Turtle's ass.
Yeah, no kidding.
I don't know why they keep doing. Why do they keep doing remakes of 80s movies? I mean, the success rate is so low. I mean, I'm trying to think of one that actually worked. And at some point, you would think Hollywood would have learned by now, but I guess not.
What, Karate Kid did okay, right? The one with Will Smith did okay.
It was not bad. Let's see. I thought the Footloose remake was pretty good.
That was decent.
You could win with superheroes usually 9 times out of 10. Although the Transformers I didn't like, but it's been enduring. That's been going. I think it's on number 7
or something like that. Superman was a okay remake of an 80s.
Superman was okay, yeah.
But
the thing is, I don't think the 80s own any superheroes. I mean, the superheroes are like.
They transcend time.
Yeah, they transcend time. There's no true 80s superhero.
Buckaroo
Banzai for Star Wars?
Buckaroo. We just recorded a podcast. We just released it 2 days ago. Nerd movies of the 80s, and Buckaroo Banzai was one of them.
Wow.
I can't watch it.
In the past. Who's in Buckaroo Banzai?
What's that?
Who's in Buckaroo Banzai?
Oh, God.
RoboCop's putting you on the spot here, Steve.
RoboCop's in it. It wasn't one of the movies I had to defend, thank God.
Oh, Peter Weller. That's
Peter Weller's in it. And, oh, geez. A lot of people are in it. But it's one of those, it's John Lithgow plays one of the villains.
I think when John Lithgow wins.
Not Buckaroo Banzai.
The funny thing is, when Lithgow was so convinced that this was going to be a great movie, I mean, he actually thought it was going to be another Star Wars. And as we all know from our studies, folks, it was not.
Right. Yeah. Buckaroo Banzai. That's one you've got to put on the list, Nick.
He did well with Harry and the Hendersons.
Is that 90s?
No, that's late 80s.
It's late 80s, yeah. You always do that, Ty. Whenever it's bad, he kind of like says, was that 90s, Nick? That was 90s. I'm like, no, it was 80s.
Nothing bad.
Pee Wee Herman came out of the 80s.
Yes.
He became a creep in the 90s. He came out of the 80s, though.
Yeah, he was
correct.
Creep in the 90s, but great in the 80s. Everything good happened in the 80s, right? There were no bad films. There was no bad pop culture in the 80s.
I did early on in the history of Stuck in the 80s. I used to get into these huge lists, and I would do them when I went on vacation. And it would always be like the 80 funniest movies of the 80s. And one one of the earliest ones I did was 80 worst movies of the 80s. And I never liked to go negative on Stuck in 80s, but I felt the need to. And I was surprised by how easy it was to come up with 80 really bad movies that we can all remember from the 80s.
So what made number one?
Jim Cotta.
That's
so bad.
Good call.
Heart Bleeps was on there. Oh my God. What else? Rhinestone with Dolly Parton and Sylvester Stallone.
I went to the drive-in to see that film.
Don't get that time back.
Yeah, I was busy, thank God.
You planned that one.
Rhinestone. That could have killed careers. But Dolly Parton and Sylvester Stallone managed to make their way through. That's great stuff, Steve. So you've been doing this podcast. Nick and I, we've been doing our show now for 2 years. Mm-hmm. You've been doing podcasting now for 10 years. How have you fought pod fade?
I've never heard that term before.
The
yeah, it's been a nice. It's funny because the podcast has lasted longer than the decade that it honors now. It's a mix of co-hosts. I mean, I started out with a female co-host. We changed to a guy for a few years. That's what kind of makes it different. I mean, I'm on all 347 episodes, but who I'm talking to changes up a lot. So that's helped a lot.
How do you find
Ty? We got to start that, Ty.
What's that?
Switching up co-host. I dumped you off.
We've done that though. We've done that. You're right.
We have.
You've hosted shows with Lydia Cornell. Speaking of the 80s,
I think what helps too is though this show's only 2 years old, we've both been podcasting forever with a multitude of hosts in sports and the sports job.
Right.
So that helps. I mean, really, this podcast breathes fresh air into me, no question about it. I was ready to pod fade, Ty.
That's right. That's right. And then Nick and I talked about doing a show about pop culture, and so we invented Beats and Eats. It was supposed to be, it is about food and music and movies and TV, but of late, to be honest, Steve, it's been everything 80s.
Yeah, it's been about the 80s.
Well, because we're kind of in the sweet spot right now for the 80s. Nostalgia usually always works like 30 years. There's a sweet spot of about 30 years after something happened that it really becomes popular again. And it was the same thing in the 80s. If you remember in the early 80s, everything was about the 50s. I mean,
it's Back to the Future.
It's Back to the Future is about the 50s. Some of the goofier movies, The Heavenly Kid.
Susie Q, or what was it? Peggy Sue.
Peggy Sue Got Married, set in the 50s. Happy Days was, began in the 70s, but ended in like 1984. The 50s. I mean, it over and over and over again. My mom was like, used to lecture me like, "Oh, the 50s are here to stay forever," and I'm like, "Come on, really not." and likewise,
Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah,
Leave It to Beaver. That was they used to do the reunions in the 80s. Remember?
Sure, yeah.
It was like real creepy seeing Wally and Beaver grown up.
Oh yeah,
like they were gawky. It was kind of weird.
They were on the Love Boat.
They were on the Love Boat with everyone.
Was Tony Dow on the Love Boat? Maybe he co-starred with Lydia. I don't know. I don't remember.
Lydia Layton Cornell.
but you're so right about that, Steve. It's about a 30-year window, and I think we're 30 years from Back to the Future, St. Elmo's Fire, and other films from that,
right? Yeah.
From 85 that are being celebrated right now. And how do you keep your show fresh? I mean, my God, 10 years of talking about the 80s. How do you come up with ideas?
We find a lot of ways to fillet the fish. That's how I always kind of put it. In the early days, we literally thought this thing might last 10 or 20 episodes. And so we would have an episode on new wave in the 80s. We tried to cover an entire genre in 20 minutes. You remember Duran Duran? Yeah, I like Duran Duran. Nowadays, we try to go a little bit more niche-y. We talk about 5 movies. We'll do a show on 5 great breakup movies of the 80s or something like that. Or I'll get a chance to talk to somebody interesting, like Mike Reno from Loverboy's available. Do we want to talk to him for 30 minutes and stuff like that?
Right.
So interview shows makes it really easy. But then, when a movie turns 30 years old or 35 years old, that's a great time to look back too and say, let's talk about The Breakfast Club was the very first podcast we ever did. And when we turned 10 years old, we redid it. Because we knew that we'd done a subpar job, to put it mildly, the first time around. I think it was 14 minutes long. When we redid it, it was like 90 minutes long. And so, and we had all the tricks down, and we knew we were a little bit more polished. So all those things helped a little bit.
Plus, back in 2005, nobody was listening. Who was listening?
Nobody. Well, it was funny because
Your mother.
Yeah,
Your grandmother.
I couldn't even talk my mom into it. We did it as a way of avoiding work. I worked in the internet department at a newspaper in St. Petersburg, Florida, and podcasting was becoming a thing, and it seemed like a great way to avoid actually doing real work. And so we sat around and thought, what topic could we talk about every week that wouldn't seem like work? And we settled on the 80s, and I never had any thought that anybody would be listening. And then suddenly we started getting emails, and people can quote shows that we did 8 years ago.
Isn't that scary?
Oh, it's horrifically scary. It happens every week. Someone will say, they'll give me a line from that I said 8 years ago. I'm like, I have no recollection of that.
So you write for the Tampa Bay Times, right, Steve?
I work for them now as a correspondent. I worked with them full-time for 17 years. And so 7 years of the podcast was when I was there full-time. I still do it, and I still write the Stuck in East blog for them as a correspondent.
And where can we find that at?
It's at tampabay.com/blogs/80s.
And I was just on there. You have the greatest random stuff on there. Anybody that'll post a Roseanne Cash video knows his 80s.
Yeah. We try to, the blog is a great way to break news. Like now I'm going to have to go research this whole Roadhouse thing and write a blog item about that and condemn it in the same voice.
There is nothing like Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze. It is crack for men, right?
Anything, especially, you can't, it's too soon.
How dare they touch this classic?
Come on, man. I feel bad about naming my cat after him, but no, it's been fun. For the longest time there, I did the blog every single day, 365 days a year, to prove to the other bloggers that I worked with that it could be done. I'm like, if I can blog about something that's been dead for 30 years and I can do it every single day, surely you can write about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers a couple times a week.
Easily.
Right.
So that was the whole purpose. I mean, a lot of it was my sandbox, and I wanted to play in it and I wanted to learn some things from it. So, that was a nice byproduct of the whole thing.
So not to get cheesy, Steve, what do the 80s mean to you? Because obviously you've devoted a lot of your life to spending time researching that decade. You lived through the decade. Why is it so special to you?
I've always grappled for a really great answer to that question. When I was doing my first really big interview about 9 years ago, I had a chance to interview Rick Springfield in person. Nice. And if there's anybody who is synonymous with the 80s, it's him. I mean, and so I asked him why all the nostalgia for the 80s. And he summed it up, I thought, pretty well. He's basically said, we all have a mystical attachment to that little window of time that we grew up in, like, from maybe like a year or two before high school to maybe the end of college. And that's when the movies impact you. That's when you go through puberty. That's when music, that's when you hear a song for the first time, you decide to memorize it and you listen to it 300 million times. You have all the time in the world. And you have such a clean slate to work with. And so you get to fit, and so in the 80s, you get to fill it up with some amazing things. I mean, it was a great, at least 2/3 of a decade in music. I kind of like to think that the 80s were kind of like starting to wane by 1987. I almost kind of adjust my thinking that the 80s kind of started with Star Wars and stuff like that in the late 70s and the beginning of New Wave with Talking Heads. And they kind of start to go downhill after Live Aid a little bit.
Interesting. So you didn't like the hair metal era, for instance?
No. I mean, I was in college about the time that happened, so I was listening to
Husker Du.
Yeah, Husker Du, exactly. I wasn't listening to Poison. To this day, I kind of whenever I
neither was I.
Yeah, whenever I have to do an interview with a band from that era, it is hard because you really have to study, because to come up with 20 good questions for Tommy Lee is not easy when you didn't listen to him growing up.
What, do you have 20 answers? I doubt it.
No, that was actually one of my more infamously bad interviews. There have been many. So Cyndi Lauper was a similarly bad interview.
Why?
She was touring. A lot of it is when you catch them. Mm-hmm. And Cyndi was touring on a jazz album or a blues album that she just put out. And so that's what she wanted to talk about. She didn't want to talk about the Goonies and She's So Unusual. She wanted to talk about, gut bucket blues. And I had no 0.0 interest in that.
Right.
And, so it made for a chirpy, a little tense at times. If I'd caught her like 2 years later, I would have caught her on the 30th anniversary of She's So Unusual. And we would have had a ball, I presume, talking about the old days and what it was like to record that album. But you catch them on the right time, things I think work out pretty well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we're catching people at the right time now. We just had Robbie Gray from Modern English on the show. We just had John Parr, of course, of St. Elmo's Fire on Beats and Eats. Just great interviews, Steve. Just guys so willing to talk about the past. And it made for a lot of fun, didn't it, Nick?
It did, sure did. Yeah, and great listening.
I've talked to Robbie.
I'm the only one listening. I'm the only one listening. Yeah, Robbie Gray was good.
He had so many great stories from back when that band broke, and they were so popular here in Florida, of all places, and just it caught them completely off guard. I mean, they caught lightning in a bottle, with that one song. And
as he says, it pays the bills, and that's why they're still around. That one song, and they're going to be on the 80s cruise, and so are you, Steve. How did you get involved?
I heard about it. I saw a Facebook post about it. Before it had even been announced. I think Alan Hunter from MTV had put a post up about it, and I freaked out. I just thought I was like, I like going on cruises anyway. So the idea of an 80s themed cruise just hits all my buttons. And so I blogged about it. And the next day I got an email and a call from the company that's producing it saying, we haven't even really announced it formally, but we were actually going to call you next, Steve, and talk to you about partnering up with us on this cruise. And so we did. And so basically I'll be on the cruise. And so will my podcast partner. We'll do some shows from the cruise. In the lead up to the cruise, we've been doing interviews with all the bands that are going to be on the cruise, some of which I'd already interviewed. So it's gonna be fun. I think I've been waiting for this now I think I learned about it a little bit before, a year before it happened. So like 14 months build up. for a 7-day cruise. I mean, you probably don't want to be around me when the cruise is over. I think I'll have a meltdown.
We hope to meet you while we're there because we're going to go on it as well. So,
excellent.
Yeah. I'm taking my significant other, and it's going to be a blast. I've never been on a cruise either, Steve. It's also my 50th birthday. So this is very cool. Yeah, very cool celebration for me.
Never been on a cruise. Wow.
Not once. I'm out here in Washington State. So I'm in Seattle, Dixon, Scranton. So I'm a little too young for Alaskan cruises.
Yeah. I agree with that.
That doesn't really interest me.
It's going to be some people either love them or hate them. Some people fall right in the middle. But I think with this one, because it's so, even if you hate cruising, I can't imagine you hating this cruise. The way that this has been planned out, there's so much stuff to do. I mean, there's so many bands, and then every night's a theme night. I mean, I'm still like losing sleep over what movie costume I'm going to come up with.
I'm going as Howard the Duck.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's not a bad one, even though it's an awful film. But yeah, I know. It's like, can you bring enough suitcases with all these events going on?
Oh, I know. We're thinking about like 3 suitcases each at this point. The last thing we were leaning towards was being Lewis and Gilbert from Revenge of the Nerds.
Nice.
But dress up like they do for the talent show with the yellow jumpsuits and carry around the little mixer boards and stuff like that. So I've been buying jumpsuits and having them delivered, and they're all not quite the right size. I'm going to go broke buying jumpsuits for the 80s cruise.
Very cool. No, it is amazing how many events have been planned for this event, and I just wonder. I'm serious when I say this, how I'm going to pack, right? Because there are so many different things going on.
My advice is pack super light because it's going to be hotter than hell. It's the Caribbean, and year round it's 90 degrees, and there's not. Thankfully, most cruises would have a formal night or at least 2 formal nights. I don't think they're doing it on this cruise because every night's a theme night. So that's a suit and a tie you can leave home at least. So
there you go. I told Nick I'm going to just wear my white Gennaro loafers, white linen pants, and white linen jacket with a mint T-shirt the entire time.
Perfect. Yep. See,
and I'm going for the Freddie Mercury Live Aid outfit.
It'll work. I'm telling you, I think
wife beater jeans. That's it.
I really think that, I mean, whoever comes up with the best costume for that night will be like king for a week. I mean, I really think that's the ultimate test.
We're going to be so sick of neon, though, don't you think? By the time it's over with.
I think I made the neon beach party night. I think I may have to take a pass on that and do something else. Maybe like go see a movie screening or something like that. Yeah, neon was never my thing in the 80s. I was more mopey, wear the trench coat and stuff like that.
And like the buttons on your trench coat.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I still have hundreds in a bottle here. That I'm looking for a use for them. So I finally found one.
Do you have the polished cotton skinny tie?
Yep, I have a few. I have the obligatory checkerboard tie. I have the obligatory keyboard tie. I have them all.
Members only jacket. Lots of Velcro.
I miss Velcro.
Velcro was easy.
Velcro.
You guys remember those Reebok high tops that were
mid
80s? Those things were so damn ugly. Yet I busted my mom's chops to buy me a pair like day after day until she finally broke down and did it.
Yeah. Or the Converse moon boots, right?
Yeah.
The Converse where you could where the Converse you slip the slides in so you could change the color of the Remember the Converse sneakers? You slip the slides in so you could change the color of the logo.
What decade were the pumps? Was that the 80s?
That is
90s. That was D Brown tie. D Brown. Come on. Boston Celtics.
Oh man, I just broke the cardinal rule and didn't get the decade right. So, Steve, this is a more serious question. It's one I wanted to ask you. I've listened to a few of your episodes.
Okay.
You got to break down the decade for us. You got to break down the differences from the early 80s, the mid 80s, and the late 80s. What are the differences to you?
The early 80s are an interesting time because you have, from a musical standpoint anyway, you have soft FM not quite yet gone. So you're still in the era of Kenny Rogers being able to score number one hit, but you're also in the same area where the cars are upon you. So you have soft FM, you have this new wave, you have AC/DC with the rock, you have all these people occupying far centers of the musical universe. And then I think what happens is as the years go on, they become closer and closer. So suddenly new wave has more of a rock feel to it, and FM soft FM kind of just disappears, stuff like that. So by like 1983, 1984, you're now in like the sweet spot of Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet, even Wham. So if you want something a little softer, you got Wham. You still have you like hard rock, but you still want to be a little interesting. Well, then you have Billy Idol. So you have like this great convergence, and MTV really is the one, in my mind, that gets the credit for making that mix work. So. And then after Live Aid, Live Aid comes, 1985, boom, dead center of the decade. Our Woodstock, I like to call it. It's such an era of possibilities. Like some bands come skyrocketing out of it. U2 comes out of that thing like a rocket with their live recording of Bad. Suddenly everybody cares about U2. And then someone like Duran Duran, who's owned music for the last 3 or 4 years, they implode. They have a horrible performance. We don't hear from them again for another 10 years. So, and then what are we left with? Like we're left in the late 80s kind of sorting through the rubble. So you have the post-punk sounds of Husker Du. You're starting to get the Debbie Gibsons and the Tiffany's are starting to sift through the pop rubble to find their little place in the universe. Hair metal has replaced any sort of respectable metal in my mind. And then just when we think we've all got it all figured out, grunge. And the world as we know it ends.
I'm going on.
We could thank the hair metal.
I'm going on the grunge cruise.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I'd like you to bring this briefcase with me on the grunge cruise if you don't mind. Pay no attention to the ticking sound inside.
Yeah, no kidding.
I can never imagine a grunge cruise. I can't imagine that crowd or the bands would have want anything to do with it. And
I can't imagine a 90s cruise, to be honest, Steve.
Well, you have it to some degree, but you have it with like the boy bands. So New Kids on the Block or NSYNC, and like they'll have their little cruises, and it's cutesy and everything. But no, I don't think you will see a 90s cruise anytime soon. I mean, it doesn't seem like their thing, you know?
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like a fun era. Yet the economy was zooming along under Clinton.
Sure.
But yet nobody was having any fun. Everybody was depressed. Go figure. In the 80s, we have Iran-Contra. We've got all these problems, although Reagan's smiling, and everybody's having a great time.
Yeah.
That's why.
It's weird. When I used to have another competing blog when I worked at the St. Pete Times called Soundcheck, and that guy was a 90s freak. And he wore black every day. He was pale like a vampire and never saw the light of day. And, you know, he would wax poetically about all his 90 bands and, you know, the 90s revival. And I'm like, look, buddy, we're never going to hear the Spin Doctors ever again. Give it up.
So true. Well, Steve, it is interesting. Nick and I talk about this all the time on the podcast. Will we be hearing anything from the 90s years from now? But we truly believe we'll be hearing songs from the 80s. We still do.
Yeah, I torture myself with that very question quite often. The history tells us that there will be a 90s revival. We might be in it now. It might be like El Nino, and it might be a mild weather phenomenon where we've got to put up with a couple of crazy bands doing tours that we don't really want to see, you know. But I don't know. I'd like to think no. I'd like to think that the 90s, at least in my mind, don't have the intangibles that the 80s have. They don't have they weren't. I mean, MTV wasn't a factor anymore in the 90s. I struggle to come up with a fashion statement that the 90s can